Hi, Oscar again. A third in a series of the Bible for Atheists. I'm doing this not a theologian or pastor or anything like that, but I've been studying the Bible for a good long time. Atheists don't study the Bible much, so that's why I'm putting this out. Christians are encouraged to add comments, especially if you have corrections to things that you think I've gotten wrong. So today I went through yesterday's the other day, and I see a few gaps that I needed to fill in. I'll do that later. But I want to do the New Testament today. To understand the New Testament, I think we really need to understand some more about Paul. St. Paul, actually his name was Saul, and he took on the name Paul later on, after his conversion, I think. He was a high up Pharisee, very strict moral, well, in my opinion, you can compare him to the Taliban in a way. They had moral codes that went beyond what I think was probably legitimate concern of the Old Testament rules. But he was this high up Jewish leader. Also, he had a Roman citizenship, so I'm not sure how exactly that worked, but he was also a Roman citizen. Anyway, he went around killing and persecuting Jews. Some people may argue that he didn't kill them. Well, actually, he probably did, because there's a reference to him holding Stephen's coat while Stephen was stoned, which means that he really oversaw the stoning of Stephen, who was a Christian. I don't know what relationship he had, but for professing that Jesus was Lord or something. Anyway, oversaw his murder. And then on the road to Damascus one time, he had some kind of a psychomedical event where he had a hallucination that God said, "Why are you persecuting me?" And I would love to see what some psychologists would say after he goes around killing a bunch of Jews. He gets this hallucination that Jesus says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And that changed his whole life. He was just struck. He went away for a short time, I think, to some Christian's house, Cornelius, I believe it was, thought about his life and so forth, and then came out this missionary. Went about spreading his version of the gospel. He never met Jesus, but he had been around hearing stories. He probably interviewed Christians before he put them in jail or whipped them or whatever he did. There's not much of a record of exactly how he killed him. We don't know if Paul was married, but he did have issues with women. You can get that in the... in fact, he may have been gay. There's evidence to think that he might have been gay too, and then felt very guilty about that. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing up Paul is that more than half of the New Testament is written by Paul. In fact, Paul started his writings before the Gospels and before Revelation and even before the other letters. Paul and Peter wrote letters to the churches that they started up and administered to. Paul went around the known world planting churches, going to various communities and telling about this, the one true invisible God. And got a huge response. And in fact, the churches bloomed under Paul. He probably if it weren't for Paul, I seriously doubt that, and also the fact Paul wrote a lot, and people copied his letters and spread the letters around. So, very significant missionary. And I really think that very much of the bloom of the New Testament was because of Paul's writings. And also the fact that the Romans had built roads and travel, and it's kind of like our internet. You could reach the whole world by these roads and the shipping lanes and so forth. Probably like a breakthrough in a way for the technology to spread. And the other religions didn't have so much missionaries. Like that you believed what your little town believed, and there was not a lot of pushback of like our God is better than your God, but they didn't have where they go wipe out a village because the other religion didn't meet their standards. Unlike what the Jews did, they really did wipe out villages because the other people worship Baal or other gods. And I'm sure that probably went on too. There's just not much of a record of religious genocide that I've seen. There certainly was genocide and punishment, but it was, well, I'm kind of digressing. What I want to say is that because of a common language, Latin and Greek, all over the world, and because of the roads, and the fact that Paul, as a Roman citizen, could go wherever he wanted, he spread the gospel all over. And he spread his version of the gospel all over. So sometime after Paul had written these letters, and the letters got copied, and the stories that were told spread from church to church to church, the Gospels were written. And in fact, there were lots of things written. And there's gospel of that we decided that certain people earlier in the first century decided, well, that shouldn't be included in the Bible. Like, for instance, the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel, Thomas, I think the Gospel of Thomas, and other writings, letters and so forth of the people who could write. And basically, they didn't have internet, didn't have TV, they didn't have their messages were, someone would come to the synagogue and give them some new information, and they would latch onto it like new knowledge, new information, so they would learn it. And the people who had individual gods, like one little town might worship Diana, or one little town might worship some other god, and that were pretty mythical, and not. The benefit of the myths about Jesus was that he was actually a man that they knew, or at least were told that he really did exist, and that so there were a lot of gods that were God, either virgin birth or God came down and God made man, or a man became a god, or whatever. There are a lot of those little religions around. But this one had a person, or at least the stories of him, was of a real person. So it had kind of a ring of truth to it, or a ring of closeness to it, other than that the local religions perhaps did not have. So anyway, so it spread around the world, the known world at the time, and then there was plenty of a backdrop for these people, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Especially Matthew and Mark and Luke, took what certain strains or views of those stories that were floating around, and put them to paper. We don't know whether Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or John were the ones that people say they are. There's plenty of theologians who think it was written far too late or written by other people, and probably people who did not know Jesus. Many of them. I'm not sure. Like Mark, I think probably, especially if it was John Mark. I'm not sure. But anyway, and for a long time, and the book of John, which is more, has some deeper insights, more spiritual, mystic insights of Jesus. A lot of theologians wanted to say that had to be written much, much later than the other Gospels, just because of those deeper insights that had to be developed, had to be evolved, and which I think that shortchanges the ability of theologians back then and people who have time to think and write and so forth to evolve sophisticated mythologies. But anyway, so it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the Gospels, and then the author of John appears to have written Acts as well. So Acts and John may be probably considered one book, just a continuation. But because of the size, they had to be put in different books. I'm not sure that they were written at separate times. But all of these were written probably within 100 years of the birth of Christ, but certainly not any time near the time that Jesus was alive. I think an apt comparison would if we took someone in our own history, which, by the way, we have with newspapers and other kind of stories, other kind of media that are more accurate than what they had then. Like, say, William Cody or, I don't know, Harriet Tubman or someone of a while back, and then stories about them. Like, for instance, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Really probably didn't happen, but we were all certainly taught that it was the truth, that George Washington never told a lie, and then this little story of the cherry tree. And of course, look at our own history of Columbus. Totally wrong. Even now, people don't know the tragic history of Columbus because it's been told and told and told and told, and the lies of it have. And other thing, well, just like, the Tulsa race riots, for instance, not only is not known very well, but the lies about it prevail. And the genocide of American Indians, we're still today, we're taking land away from the Indians, even now. In Arizona, for instance, McCain and what was his name? The senators, anyway, finagled to take away a holy Indian site away from the Indians. No recourse, just took it. And they traded it for some worthless land. So they said, oh, yeah, you get this other worthless land, but we'll take the land that has the coal underneath. So some Australian coal miner, or no, copper mining company came in, and the fear is they're going to decimate this piece of property, a valley, that they claim they're going to do it ecologically, but when does that ever happen, Anyway, so the stories that Paul made up and heard about and wrote about, and the letters he wrote out and then followed up by the Gospels and what they heard about and from that had been, I'm sure, circulated from church to church to church. And I've been to a lot of churches that the pastor, he's just making this stuff up. Then someone believes that, and they tell it to, again, in their congregation, or they write it in a book, and then someone says, oh, yeah, this happened, and Well, there's an example. Billy Graham, for instance, said that there's 3 words that for love in the New Testament: eros, agape, and philos. And then he goes on, he's got this whole set of lectures about it. Well, if you look in the New Testament, eros is not there. Not at all, ever. In fact, the closest it comes is Erasmus, which is a person. And Paul says, give my regards to Erasmus. This has nothing to do with any of the eros. But I've heard, and there's essays written, pastors pick this up, they say it over and over again, they say there's 3 words for love. Well, first of all, there's lots of words that can be translated into love, our version of love. Not just the three. Well, actually, not just the 2. Philos is, or phileo is like brotherly love, and agape is like godly love, the pure, no motivation, just expression of total grace and love. But there's like attractiveness, attractive, alluring, lascivious, passionate. There's lots of words that can be translated into love in the New Testament. So 3 doesn't work. But my point is that once these stories start, someone makes up a story. Like now we have some mechanism for debunking Facebook myths, like the little girl who gets cancer. And if we just pray for her and send $1 to someone, that, and then she'll be healed, or some kind of a story like that, and it goes viral, and people believe it, and they pass it on and on and on. Oh, please pray for this, and if she gets 1 million prayers, she'll be healed, and so forth. Well, that's not any different than what it was back then, I'm sure. As a matter of fact, there's reason to believe they were very superstitious, more so than us in the Mediterranean area there, the old world. Because they believed in myths, they took a lighter view of myths, I think. Miracles. They took a lighter view of miracles, but they had their myths and they accepted them, and so in their version, went viral. So I really think a lot of the stuff, like, did Jesus feed 4,000 or did he feed 5,000? Or did he do both, with a few fish and loaves of bread? Or was it some pastor who wanted to have his sermon be really a snappy sermon, so he put that in? We don't know. Did Jesus really walk on water? Or did someone make it up, like 50 years later, make it up because they wanted to, it was, did you know that Santa Claus was a poem, or the little Merry Christmas was a Methodist minister made up the little thing of Santa coming down the chimney. Now everyone thinks that's how it was. That Santa really came down a chimney. Well, they think that's the real story. Well, it started in a church by a minister making something up to embellish his sermon. I had a pastor once who got messages from God from his pigs. And he would get up there and actually talk to us in pig language. He would go, and stuff, and say that he was inspired by this sermon or this something because the pig knew something, So people make stuff up. And the more the church, my experience is, the more that churches get away from sticking to what's written, either in the Bible or in their liturgical formula, their whatever they, like Catholics and Lutherans and Episcopals, they tend to stick with what's written. And they don't tend to as much make stuff up, like the little church I was in Tohola, where the stuff the pastor made up was the Lighthouse Church, which is a Pentecostal church. And anyway, a lot of the New Testament, I think, is stuff that was just a collection of all. And even like, for instance, Matthew has the Sermon on the Mount. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, it's not a sermon. It's obviously a collection of a bunch of things that Jesus, who I really did believe was probably one of many Jesuses. There was probably one Jesus who was a rabbi. Jesus was a common name back then, so I'm sure there must have been a lot of rabbis named Jesus. But there was probably one that there's enough stories about him that probably really, he wasn't just totally made up out of thin air. He was really a historical figure. But the stuff written about him, the walking on the water, the creating little doves out of mud and they fly away, and that's not in the Protestant Bible, but it's and the fact that he was pure and born of a virgin, and the three wise men and all those kind of things. They had 100 years to make that stuff up from the time of his birth. And then you have to ask where some of those stories come from. Earlier I said that you really need to take a look at the author and what his motive is when he writes something. Well, their motive wasn't to capture exactly the history that it is, I don't think. Because they didn't know. They had to capture what they had heard, and I'm sure they believed it, that they heard these different things in different sermons, or it was written in other documents that people wrote. And some preachers all over North Africa and the Asian, the Mediterranean area, there were a lot of little branches and a lot of them, just like the Jewish traditions of a lot of different sects and a lot of different beliefs and arguments between them. The Christian church at the beginning was very much like that. People didn't believe he was God at all. People believed he was God, but he didn't die on the cross. People believed various things. So anyway, the stuff that got written down was a lot of Paul's letters, got recopied, and then the Gospels and the book of Revelation, and basically that's kind of what the New Testament is. My personal belief is that it's got a lot of history in it, and I think that, but I also, most of it is what we interpret it. Like first book of Romans, a lot of people talk about how the first chapter of Romans. Paul was writing to the Romans within, a couple of decades of when Caligula and who was before him? Was it not Titus? Well, anyway, these emperor-level leaders had terrible debauchery in there, just bizarre murder for the sense of seeing the blood. It was just, and orgies and drunkenness and all this. So the first chapter, when Paul writes to Rome, he includes this. Now, he doesn't say Caligula in it. So a lot of people who read that think that the first book of Romans, it says they had all the evidence to know and worship God, and they chose not to. And that they gave, in fact, the anti-LGBT people cite Romans 1 as that they were put to death because they got what was coming to them because of their laying their abuse of themselves and abuse of women or something like that. If you clearly look at it and compare what happened in the Roman in Rome with Caligula, and you see Paul's version of how he feels about what's righteous and what's not righteous and so forth. To me, it's clear that Paul was not writing about how we should treat women or how we should treat men. He was talking about his outrage at this what was going on, not in the churches, but in Roman government. And also, he probably had to be a little bit cautious because you could be in real trouble. In fact, I think that the reason that John of Patmos hid in a cave, tradition is that he hid in a cave on some island to write Revelation, and then he wrote in code. Code that we can't necessarily understand. That's where we get the number 666 from. There's reasons to think that's Nero, and that's a whole different thing. Not that it's the mark of the beast or whatever. I mean, that we should be worried looking for someone that has 666. When I was in, I think it was a Bible study when I was in the Navy. No, I think I was in Australia at the time in a Bible study. We studied the fact that Ronald Wilson Reagan was 666, and that he recovered from a fatal wound, which is another thing that's supposed to happen, and that he ended up having a head injury. Well, what's Alzheimer's? And that, what was it? He used to live at 666 Hollywood Drive or something like that, and he had it changed to 668. Because I don't know, I doubt if he believed it, but he wanted to capture the religious right vote. So he had to get rid of that 666 off his address. Anyway, so the New Testament wasn't really accepted completely until like what was it? 4th century, early part of the 4th century, when it was finally nailed down. A lot of churches believed on this and that, but by the end of the 1st century, they pretty much had all the books, and other books too. Different churches had different ones and so forth. And the main force of the Catholic Church pretty much had it nailed down by the end of the 1st century. But when you think of that, that's 100 years. What happened 100 years? Like, for instance, do we have a myth about how Robert E. Lee was born or whoever? We don't. Suppose somebody made it up, especially since it was some little village, like the mother of, all those little stories. We don't know where those came from, but we believe that, that must have happened, must have been a virgin. In fact, Mary had to be a virgin, which means she had to be born from a virgin, which her mother had to be immaculate as well, also without sin. So, because the thing is that you can't have sin coming out of sin and so forth. So, anyway, that's kind of my take on the New Testament. It's interesting to look at what they call the non-canon gospels too. Some of them don't look like gospels at all. I'm trying to think of. Some of them are just quotes, little like the Proverbs. Each line stands alone. I think that's James. James is a letter, but was there a Gospel of James? I'm not sure, but it's. I'm doing this off the cuff with no notes. So, and also I'm just trying to just share a little bit of whatever. So if there's any comments, Christians are welcome. Theologians are welcome. I beat up a lot on certain groups of people, especially the ones who declare that their own vision is the vision that God told them for the rest of the world. Like Paul, visions can be very, very real, but they're hallucinations. It's what your brain is making up. I've had hallucinations, not terrible ones or whatever, but I've heard things that were never said. And people claim I've said things that I'm sure I never said. I've not seen things that obviously were there. I've seen things that appeared after looking into it, appeared not to be what I thought they were. So your brain tries to find its way through the world and makes up stuff to fill it in. Did you know that you had a blind spot in each eye that you cannot see what's beyond it, and your brain fills in the gap? I'll talk about this later. Your brain actually paints in your blind spot in your eye, and it does it by taking information from the rest of what you see to paint in that little blind spot. Anyway, that's aside. I've used up enough of your time. I'll be back. I'll probably float through this stuff again in future times, try to fill in gaps and so forth. Anyway, leave your likes or responses or whatever, criticism, okay? Because I see it as a learning thing. Bye for now.